What is going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 31 of the Caught by Happy podcast. I am Matt Harrington, and this is my show. This is my podcast. This is my little project I like to do when I can get a few minutes of quiet, when the kids are playing outside or watching a movie or they're over at their grandma's. And with this little podcast of mine, as you know, I talk to people who are doing what they love or somehow chasing a dream or following their passions. I think today's guest falls into the category of someone who has followed her interests in terms of educational pursuits and then married it with her natural curiosity about cultures other than her own. Do you remember when you had summer friends? I had a summer friend in today's guest. I met Kelli Swazey when I was 14 or 15 years old. In the summer, she would come over to my little town and stay with her grandmother for a couple of weeks. Now, her grandma lived next door to a good friend of mine. So, of course, I would hang out over at my friend's house. And somehow we met because we were the same age. And there truly isn't anything for a 15-year-old to do in my small little country hometown except look for other teenagers to hang out with and have bonfires with and listen to music with and talk about our very important 15-year-old lives. So this is the early 90s. I, of course, was a grunge kid. But Kelli, she went a little deeper than that. She was like a New England punk, and I thought it was strange and yet fascinating to hear her talk about the bands she was into. And she'd bring these tapes of different punk bands, and we would listen to them at the bonfire, or these like spoken word tapes about topics that were strange and fascinating. And then the summer was done, and she was gone. I'd go back to school, and maybe the next summer she'd come back with a shaved head and a few more tapes to listen to. But I think after a couple of years, we just lose touch. That's what happens. We go our separate ways, and everything kind of fades into teenage memories. So fast forward to a few years ago. I'm sitting in my office at work looking for some info on a topic that I'm sure wasn't relevant to my job at all. But I come across this TED Talk by a Dr. Kelli Swazey. And she's talking about some island in Southeast Asia where it's customary to keep a dead relative in the house with your family for years. Well, of course, I just knew that, yes, this is exactly where my little New England punk friend from 1994 would eventually end up, on a stage giving a lecture as a doctor about a topic that I found strange and yet fascinating. So, long story short, we reconnected through the magic of social media, and I asked her to come on this podcast and talk about how she came to live in Indonesia, what she does there, and why she does it. And we're going to jump in head first to that chat with Dr. Kelli in just a minute. But first, if you're still going to the grocery store and walking around picking out tomatoes and smelling the melons or poking the chicken or waiting in line at the deli counter, save yourself the time and sign up for Instacart if you haven't already. I'm telling you, it's been a big old weight off of our shoulders not having to spend a couple hours at the grocery store battling crowds, especially now during this virus, not having to wait in line or deal with the traffic. Hey, sign up for Instacart using the link in my show notes. They'll deliver groceries in as fast as 1 hour, and they connect you with personal shoppers in your area to shop and deliver groceries from your favorite stores. You'll also get highlighted deals to help you save some money. So sign up with the link in the show notes, and that'll let Instacart know that I sent you and will help support the creation of this here podcast. Also, be sure you're subscribed if you're not already. That way, every time I drop a new episode, it will automatically be ready and waiting for you in your podcast feed. Please leave a rating or review, and if you want, give Caught by Happy a follow on any of your favorite social networks. And if you want to be a guest or just drop me any kind of note, you can reach me at caughtbyhappy@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Okay, back to Kelli. This one was a fun one for me. I wasn't sure what it was going to be like talking to someone I've only known as a scrappy teenager, but as soon as she started talking, it all came flooding right back. She's still the same old Kelli from Maine with the chunky shoes and the crazy hair, but now she's just Kelli from Indonesia with, I don't know what kind of shoes she wears now, and her hair wasn't crazy at all. I had fun. I had a lot of fun. And I hope you enjoy this chat with my summer friend. She's a scholar, an educator, consultant, advocate, an all-around interesting person. And I got to say, this chat was recorded before they announced that they would be removing the Confederate monuments here in Richmond, Virginia, which is unfortunate because I really would have liked to talk to her about that topic. But Kelli and I do talk quite a bit at the end of this podcast about how the Black Lives Matter movement is being seen around the world and the effects that it's having in Southeast Asia specifically. So stick around for that part of the conversation. I think it's really relevant. It's interesting. And it's good to get someone's perspective who has been living outside of the country for the past decade or so. So here's my chat with Dr. Kelli Swazey.
Well. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So you've got this whole podcast thing all set up and going. This is so impressive.
Yeah, it's real impressive compared to what you've got going on.
No, I have no idea how to do a podcast. It's not something that's in my skill set. So I'm always really impressed when people are producing this kind of stuff. I know that producing media is a serious endeavor that takes a lot of time. So I am totally appreciative of the efforts you're putting in for this.
Well, I'm glad somebody is.
How's life?
Oh man, life is crazy. I mean, I want to know what's going on with your life. We haven't seen each other in 25, maybe more
Yeah,
years.
wow, that's kind of scary, right? I was trying to do, I was thinking about this today and thinking, okay, I got to think about my life for the past 25 years and just working backward. Okay, how long ago was that? The last time we saw each other? What? That was like another world, Matt. That was,
It was another world. Christ, I was like what, 15? We were
yeah,
15-ish.
yeah, 15, 16,
So,
something like that. Yeah. In Western New York, of all places, you know?
in rural Western New York.
Right? Yeah.
Back then, you
Yes.
would come up to Western New York to visit your grandmother.
Yep.
I was friends with the guy who lived next door to your grandmother.
The crops, yes.
Yes, yes, and
Bad.
that's how we met. So we would
Yeah.
hang out for a few weeks in the summer for like 2 years, maybe 3 years, and then we all went our separate ways.
Yeah, that's right. We all went on and had our lives, I guess.
Yeah. So tell me about where you grew up, why you were coming to New York in the first place, and then what the turns that your life took in high school and beyond.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I know you're kind of, an important big deal right now.
Oh, that's so sweet of you to say. I'm definitely not a big deal, but gosh, I would aspire to be a big deal. I think I'm that big of a deal. So I I grew up basically living all over the country because my father worked for Eastman Kodak, which of course now is the defunct company that was in New York, and
Mhm.
is from Western New York. So that's where his parents lived and have lived for 50 something years, although they're both originally from Canada. One's from New Brunswick and the other from PEI. And when they immigrated to the States, they ended up in Western New York and they've been there ever since. My grandfather just passed away quite recently at the age of 92.
Yeah, I saw that, and I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it was very sad, but also he had lived this really amazing good life. So, sad and happy at the same time, a bit bittersweet.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we traveled all over the country for my dad's job. Although my mom is originally from New England, from Maine, southern Maine. And so we would travel all over. And then in the summers, my sister and I would kind of get shipped to Western New York to, be babysat by grandma and grandpa, give mom and dad a break a bit. And of course, we loved it because it was just the most magical place in the summertime for kids to go to Western New York with the farm stands and all of that space around us that we didn't necessarily have where we lived. Out in my grandfather's Ford 150 red and white truck, going to the drive-in movies, that kind of thing. Like we just thought it was the best thing ever. So that's why I was in Western New York in the summers. And then when I was in junior high, we moved back to New England, where my mom's from, and that's where I basically grew up. Was in New England, so Maine and New Hampshire.
What kinda kid were you? I remember what you were like as a teenager.
Oh, you should tell me. I think at that time I was a bit in my punk phase, right? So I was,
Yeah, yeah. I think that's why I wanted to hang out with you because we didn't get much, like we had, like, the country punks out near us, but we didn't have those real New England punks coming down, hanging out. I
yeah,
remember you coming with, like, cassette tapes of stuff I hadn't heard before, and, like, I loved it. I was all about it.
yeah, it was a fun time. I think at that I was definitely full in rebellion phase at that age.
Mm,
Shaved head and mohawks and
yeah.
studded clothing. Still got a bit of that going on, not as much. And I think that was just where I was living at the time in New Hampshire, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which was not that far from Boston, only about an hour's drive away. Had a really big music scene and a really big punk scene, and so that was a big part of me. And growing up in high school was being a part of that, and a part
Yeah.
of that community and the music, and I think the political organizing part of that as well. So yeah, that was me, little punk kid going to Western New York. Kind of funny to think about, and I think that lasted through the end of high school, really. So I don't come from a family that is necessarily comes from an educational background. Neither of my parents went to college. I had applied to go to college my senior year of high school and I got into a very well-known liberal arts college in Massachusetts, in Amherst, but it was so expensive that I just couldn't imagine taking out that much in loans to go to school. It was something like $35,000 a year, and it was so overwhelming at the age of 18 to think about having to pay that back sometime in the near future, 4 years down the road. And so I just sort of got overwhelmed and decided, oh, I can't really do this. Maybe this isn't for me. So at that point, I went to work like everybody does at that age when you're not going to school. It's been interesting thinking about you asking me to talk about how did I end up where I am. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I think what's going on in the US right now is part of the story of why I decided to follow a different sort of path. What was going on in the early 2000s in the United States. And it's sort of turned into this long journey. And now here I am after 10 years of living in Southeast Asia. So I've been in Indonesia now for almost a decade, which is pretty amazing when I sort of like say that out loud and think about it.
Yeah. So why did you go there in the first place? Of all the places that you could go, how did you end up there?
Okay, so I'm working right at a record store and various jobs in New England, and September 11th happens. And
Hmm.
I remember really clearly being really overwhelmed by the way people were reacting in New England around me. New England, which is an incredibly white place, so I didn't grow up surrounded by diversity whatsoever. I think there was
Yeah.
really one Black individual in my high school, if that. And so I just was really upset and overwhelmed by the sort of racism that had been there that perhaps I wasn't aware of at that time, that just came to the surface very quickly. I can remember in particular, there was a Muslim family that lived in our town, and I knew they were Muslim because, the woman wore a hijab, and they were at Walmart one day, and people were sort of giving them dirty looks, and I was so terrified for them that I sort of followed them around and made sure they got in their car and went home okay. And so I think, I was 21 when 2001 happened,
Hmm.
and I was just kind of struggling with this idea of like, I don't really know anything about the world other than this little corner of it that I live in. I lived in different parts of the country, but still the majority of my childhood, I grew up in a very non-diverse New England. I just kind of said, okay, well, I need to learn something about something. I need to go somewhere. So at the time, I was really interested in Buddhism, and I wanted to go to India. And I tried to volunteer for an organization. So I drove actually to New York to go and spend some time at the place where this organization was headquartered. And after the second day there, I realized it was a huge scam.
Hmm.
They were trying to get money from people, and I was like, "Oh no, this is not what I want." I was
Yeah.
really disappointed. I wanted to go by myself, but there was some political unrest in northern India at that time, and people were saying, "Oh, you can't really go there by yourself right now. It's not a good idea." So I sort of looked around. I said, "Well, where else in the world is there Buddhism?" Oh, Thailand. The Thais are Buddhists. Like, let's do that. Because at the time, tickets to Southeast Asia were incredibly cheap because this was still in the slump, in the post 9/11 slump. People weren't really traveling, especially Americans. And so we got this really cheap ticket to go, and I flew to Thailand. So I saved up some money and I flew to Thailand, knowing absolutely nothing about Southeast Asia. And I think the original plan was to stay for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And as soon as I got there, I changed my ticket to come home like 3 months later, much to the
Oh, really?
of my family. Oh yeah. And this was pre-internet time. So it's not like I was sending emails home all the time. It was basically like, hey mom, I'm in Southeast Asia. We'll send you an email in a week, kind of thing. Or I'll call you from they had these little boxes, these little like things on the side of the road where you'd give someone money and they'd connect you to the US. So you'd call them from these little telephone boxes kind of thing.
Where were you staying, or were you just kind of hopping around?
I was with a friend and we traveled all over. We started in Bangkok and then we went up around Thailand, so up to northern Thailand, traveling by train, kind of the backpacker thing. Ended up going down to the south of Thailand and then going to Malaysia. And at the time, we had a decision whether we were going to go up to the north part of Southeast Asia, go to like Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, Vietnam, or if we were going to go to island Southeast Asia, so down towards Indonesia. And even in southern Thailand at that time, people kept saying to us, don't go to Indonesia because there's a lot of Muslims there and it's very dangerous. I was still just kind of trying to figure out, like, what is going on with all this? I don't really understand what our hatred of this whole group of people is. And I just had it in my mind that I really wanted to go to Sumatra because we could take a boat from Penang, Malaysia, over to Sumatra. And I thought, oh, that just sounds Sumatra. It sounds like such an amazing place. So we decided to take the boat to Sumatra. And there was no one on the boat. There weren't a lot of people traveling in Southeast Asia at that time. So it was very much like it is now. It was very quiet in a tourism sense.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up in North Sumatra in Medan. I remember getting off the boat and this young guy came up to me wearing an Osama bin Laden t-shirt. And I was terrified because I didn't know what was going on. And he said, do you want to go up and see these orangutans up in North Sumatra? And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. And so we ended up taking a ride with these guys and going up to this orangutan rehabilitation center in North Sumatra. So that was the beginning of my Indonesia time.
Wow.
Yeah. But as soon as I got to Indonesia, there was something about the place, and I fell in love, as that story goes. You know, the white person goes traveling and falls in love with a foreign country. I had, I think for me, really profound connections with people in Indonesia at that time. People were really worried and upset, and tourism, of course, had taken a nosedive, which is a huge industry here. And so for them, it was a difficult time. Mm-hmm. But I remember traveling to Central Java, which is where I've lived for the past 10 years, and meeting other young people who were my age, 21, 22. They would ask me, why do you hate me so much? And this, at that age, just floored me. I was like, how could I hate you? I didn't even know what this country was a matter of a few months ago. I don't hate you. I don't even know you. But the perception was that Americans hated all Muslims. And because Indonesia is a majority Muslim country, in fact, the most populous Muslim country in the world, that we hated them. And this was just a real eye-opener for me about the way in which American policy and what Americans do and say affected people all over the world. So that was like the beginning of this whole saga, essentially.
And the other way around, too. It wasn't, why do you hate me? It's, I'm sure Americans would have been saying, why do you hate us?
Yeah. And so just having that kind of connection with people that were my own age and being like, wow, there's this whole world out here that I don't understand a lot about, that I think I need to know more about. And I think everybody needs to know more about. I think that's really what became apparent to me at the time. So traveled around Indonesia for quite some time, met a lot of interesting people, had some really fascinating experiences. Came back to the US. There were two things that happened quite soon after that, in the years after that. So I came back to the US in mid-2002. And I decided, okay, you know what, I need to go to school because I really need to know more about what's going on with the world. And I think going to school is the way to do that. I can't afford to go to an expensive liberal arts college, so I'm just going to try and go to the state school here, which was the University of New Hampshire. I was working and I finally was able to get admitted to the school. I was living in Somersworth, New Hampshire, which is a very old factory working class town. And I went into the Chinese market one day because I was missing all the fun foods that I had eaten in Asia. And I heard these people speaking Indonesian. Now, I didn't speak Indonesian, but I knew enough to know that it was Indonesian. And I sort of ran up to them excitedly and said, "You're from Indonesia, right?" And they were really taken aback because nobody in New Hampshire knows where Indonesia is. And they're like, "How do you know we're from Indonesia?" And I said, I was just there, and I've been dying to talk to some Indonesians. And it turned out that they were this new group of immigrants that had moved to this very white town because they were fleeing discrimination in Indonesia. So they were coming from being discriminated in Jakarta in 1998 after the fall of the dictatorship, which had gone on for many years. Some of them were fleeing from eastern Indonesia, where there was religious conflict and violence. And some of them came from North Sulawesi Island, which had always been a very large Christian stronghold. So the majority of them were coming over on these religious visas sponsored by U.S. churches. And so I ended up getting involved with this community, getting to know them and documenting what was going on with them. And that became my project. My undergraduate honors thesis was doing research on this community.
How many people were in this community?
When it started, it was quite small. I'd say there was probably 20 or 30 of them that came over originally, but now there's something like 4,000 or 5,000 of them living in Seacoast, New Hampshire. So,
oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, this is now an established Indonesian community on the East Coast that I've still kept in touch with. So also as I was going to school, so I decided to major in anthropology because I thought, I guess I'm just really interested in people and culture, and anthropology seems like the way to go if that's what you're interested in. I was asked by one of my professors to help a family from the Democratic Republic of the Congo who were living in Manchester, New Hampshire. So it was a woman and a man couple named Helen and Hubert Simwarahi. They had come over on the diversity lottery and left their 7 children behind in the DRC. And they were desperate to get their children to the United States because their children were being attacked by militias. It was warfare there at the time. Their youngest was about 5 years old, and their oldest was only 16 or 17 at the time, and she was taking care of the family. So when they won the diversity lottery, Hubert was a human rights worker, and he had been attacked by militias there for being a human rights worker. When they won the diversity lottery, they thought they were going to be able to bring their children right away, and it didn't turn out that way because U.S. immigration is really complicated and definitely got far more complicated after 9/11. And so I started an organization to help them. And this turned into a 2-year legal case that got a lot of community members involved in New Hampshire. And we eventually were able to get something called humanitarian parole, which at that time had to be signed by way high up in the government. So it was John Ashcroft who actually signed the writ for this humanitarian parole. And all 7 of those children did eventually come to New Hampshire, and they were reunited with their parents. And they're all doing amazing today, and going to school, going to college, and getting married and having kids. So that's
you keep in touch with them?
I do. It's a beautiful story, and one that doesn't happen very often when those kinds of situations happen with immigration.
Right.
So I think seeing what the immigration system was like, especially after 9/11, where it had been taken over by Homeland Security. So anyway, I worked with this family, right? This African family. Yeah, those were the 2 things: meeting the Indonesian community in New Hampshire and working with this family from the DRC. That really started me thinking about what I was going to do, I think, with the rest of my life at that age. And I didn't really know anything about graduate school, but I had a really great advisor at the University of New Hampshire who encouraged me to apply for this National Science Foundation fellowship to go to grad school and do research. She told me at the time, well, you're not going to get this because it's very competitive, but you should try and apply anyway, just it's good practice for the future. I had finished my degree in 3 years at UNH with a 4.0 average. I was a presidential scholar, and I applied for this grant, and guess what? I got it. So I had funding to go to grad school, at least to do a master's degree. I thought a lot about where I wanted to go. I could have kind of pursued going to some, very big name schools, but I really liked the idea of working with people from the Asia Pacific region. And so I chose to go to the University of Hawaii, Manoa, which is one of the world's premier Asia Pacific programs. And they also have this center there called the East-West Center, which is where a lot of Indonesian scholars go to grad school. But it's where people from all over the Asia Pacific go to get scholarships to go to school at the University of Hawaii. And I think that really appealed to me, that I didn't want to be just going to school to learn about, people who lived in the Asia Pacific to then talk about them without them being there. I actually wanted to work with people from the Asia Pacific. So I moved to Hawaii and I got into the grad program there in the Anthropology department, and I started my master's degree researching the community that I had worked with in New Hampshire, but also where they came from, which was the northern part of the island of Sulawesi. So kind of expanding my project into something that was a lot bigger than what I had done in my undergraduate degree. And so that was how I ended up going to school in Hawaii for both my master's degree and my PhD in anthropology.
Wow. When did you finish that?
I finished my PhD in 2013, but I did my master's degree on the community in Indonesia, that was community from Indonesia that was living in New Hampshire, and also where they came from, kind of looking at that dynamic. And then I decided for my PhD work that I would focus more on the region where they came from because it has a very interesting political history. They are a Protestant majority region that had a lot of influence from the Dutch. That's very unique in Indonesia. So I was really interested in the politics of identity in that area of Indonesia. And I applied for a Fulbright scholarship when I was finishing my master's degree, and I got a Fulbright dissertation research grant. So in 2009, right after I finished my master's degree, I went to Sulawesi for a year to do research to write my dissertation. So although I didn't finish until 2013, I was actually living in country from 2009 to 2010, came briefly back to Hawaii for a while, and then I was offered a job at a university in Indonesia and decided to go back and work at the university in Indonesia while I was writing my dissertation and finishing my PhD.
Wow. And have you been there since?
I worked for that department. So this department was a very unique place in all of Indonesian higher education. It is called the Program for the Cross-Cultural and Religious Studies. That doesn't sound so unique in a country that has a lot of cultural diversity and religion, but in Indonesia, most people only study religion within their own religion. So they only go to university programs at a university that's from their religion. So if you're a Muslim, you go to an Islamic university and study religion. If you're Christian, you go to a Christian university. This is the only program in the country that does not belong to one religion, and it's really a very international program. So I had master's degree students who are from all over Indonesia. Some of them are activists, some of them are religious practitioners, some of them are journalists, some of them want to work in government. And we worked with a lot of international organizations as well. And so I worked there as a faculty member from 2010 until 2019. That was a pretty incredible experience.
And what were you teaching? Anthropology?
I was teaching anthropology, but a lot of different things. I taught a class on religion and film. I taught about religious influences in tourism. I taught research methods. We were also a public education center, so I did a lot of projects as well. And I kind of like brokered relationships with universities in the United States between my department in Indonesia and that. For instance, I worked with the Center for Southeast Asian Studies from the University of Hawaii for many years, along with my department in Indonesia. And we did a lot of really cool projects that have to do with diversity. So, for instance, we brought professors from the US who work in minority serving institutions to Indonesia for like 3-week courses to learn about diversity in Indonesia. Religious diversity gets a lot of focus because religion is very important in Indonesian life. It's important to people's everyday identity. Like, you don't ever have a conversation with somebody here without kind of knowing what their religion is, because it's very much a part of the way that we interact. And I also was running courses for like experiential education and taking American students, like early college students, to really rural places all over Indonesia to live with indigenous communities in the summer times. And all sorts of things. I made a film a couple of years ago with an indigenous community. So I do a lot with media and activism in different communities around Indonesia that were part of my work at this faculty. Because it was a public education center, we did advising for the government and things like that. So it was a really exciting job in a lot of ways that was more than just about teaching or researching. It was really about being involved in the sort of political and cultural life of the country in general.
Have you felt any kind of like backlash or whatever for being a American coming in and teaching cultural history, religious history, indigenous communities? Have they kind of shunned you, or do they welcome you? What has that been like?
No, I would say that on the whole, Indonesians are quite, they're very hospitable. And this goes no matter where you are in Indonesia, and that actually white people have a huge amount of privilege here. It actually is in the opposite almost. You know, I get asked to do things a lot simply because I am a white scholar that's teaching in Indonesia, even for things that I don't have any expertise in, because it's quite high status to be someone from overseas. And I think Indonesians really look up to America as well. And so to be from America and from an American university is also quite high prestige here, for better or worse. So for the most part, no, everyone has been incredibly welcoming. That's something that I have to be really careful and aware about myself. And a real big part of my career is being very self-reflective about what it is that I do here, and not drowning out other people's voices, but trying to facilitate people here to have their voices, and not being the know-it-all foreigner, which is also something that happens in Southeast Asia, where you have people come in and sort of, you know, they've been here for a short time and they just feel like they know everything. But that's also something that I work with my students. You know, I think on the whole, American students come overseas and the first thing that they say is, "Oh, we're gonna help," which is a great impulse. It's a wonderful thing about American young people, that they really want to help other people. But helping people also has this other side to it about assuming that Americans know better. And so a lot of the work that we do with experiential education is teaching students about, it's great that you want to help, but what your job to do here right now is actually to listen and learn from these people, and maybe have a different kind of relationship with the communities that you meet, not because you think you're here to teach them something, but actually because they're going to teach you something. And that's part of the process that we go through with our students, and maybe part of the process that I think as Americans we all need to be going through right now, given the current situation.
Yeah, for sure.
Learning to listen and learning that we don't always know what's right or best.
Exactly. I think that I stumbled upon you back when I saw a TED talk that you gave. I want to say it was about death rituals.
Yes. Yeah. I'm famous for talking about dead people. Interesting. That was for TED Med in I believe that was 2013. And a friend of mine who was the stage director for TED Med, they were doing a special TED Med. So TED Med is an independently organized TED that's really huge for the medical industry. So it was in DC at the Kennedy Center that year. It's a huge event. It goes on for like a week, and there's thousands of people that go, from everything from doctors to pharmaceutical companies. So it's a really interesting environment to be in. Not my background personally. And when they asked me to do this talk, they were running their first panel on the end of life care. So talking about end of life care in the United States. And they were trying to get some different perspectives. And they said, oh, this is really interesting. I had met the stage director in Malaysia actually at an event. And she said, why don't you come and talk about what it's like to be an American who's lived in this community where they have a really different attitude towards death than we do in the United States. So at the time I was married to a man from Toraja, this community in South Sulawesi that has these very unique death rituals where they actually keep the bodies of deceased family members in the house with them for a long period of time. Sometimes they're not buried until 3 or 4 years after they physically die. And during that period, they're not considered to be dead. They're sleeping, or they're in a state between life and death. And at first, my reaction was like, well, why would you want me to talk about that? Why don't you ask somebody from Toraja to talk about that? But I think what they were trying to get at was they wanted someone to sort of talk about what it was like to be an American, and then how that had changed my perspective as an American about death. And so I did that talk. Unbeknownst to me, there are certain talks that get picked by TED. So TED events happen all over the place. And then TED sort of picks individual events that they're going to then feature as a TED Talk, an official TED Talk on their page. So some months after I did the talk, I woke up one morning and there was all these weird messages in my inbox, and I'm thinking, why are people emailing me about that TED Talk that happened months ago? And a friend sent me a message and said, you should probably look on the TED page. And I was the featured talk that day on the TED page. So that changed the game entirely. And opened up a whole new world of online engagement. So
Yeah. Have you done more of that?
I have. I did a second TED Talk just a year and a half, 2 years ago now, a TEDx Ubud talk that was about my film that I made with my faculty here. And that was about cultural diversity and biodiversity, focusing on this particular community of people who live almost entirely on the ocean in Southeast Sulawesi that I've worked with for about 10 years. And for me, I think that was more of a more personal one because it was more about the work that I do. Toraja was just sort of an experience that I had personally. And I think people sort of assumed I was an expert on death. And I was like, no, I don't actually study death. I just think it's really interesting. But to this day, I still get people emailing me and saying, oh, we're making this documentary about bizarre death rituals. Like, we'd like you to speak for it. And I usually say, that's not really my thing. I just happened to do a TED Talk about it once.
Yeah.
So.
What are you planning on doing over the next few years? Are you planning on staying there? Are you planning on moving anywhere else in the world? Are you going to continue teaching?
So I left the position at the university in 2019, and I'm now working sort of as a consultant. So I do a lot of educational programming. The last 2 years, I've been an academic program officer for an Australian educational program that's called ACICIS, the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies. It's a mouthful. They have been running for about 25 years, but 2 years ago, they wanted to start a new program in Bali. And so me and my colleague kind of helped to design this program. We've just finished our second run in February. We had about 22 students from all over Australia. So they come from 17 different universities, and they come and stay with us in Bali for 6 weeks. They do 2 weeks of academic seminar and then 6 weeks of internship at different sustainable organizations, community-based tourism, activism around the island. And so this is more where I'm kind of going now, is in this kind of educational management and consulting, because I really enjoy being in the field. I really enjoy working with students. And I think that these kinds of programs are really essential to combating some of the things that we're seeing right now about people, really having a lack of awareness about diversity and difference and even history. For me personally, going to the University of Hawaii was a huge wake-up call, because I didn't know that Hawaii had been illegally annexed by the United States in the late 1800s. We never learned that in history class.
No, I don't think we did.
No, definitely don't, unless you're reading Howard Zinn or something. You're not hearing these kinds of things. And so I think that international education becomes a really important way that students get outside of the narrative that we're taught, the narrative of history, the narrative of politics that we're taught in US education systems, and they get to kind of see for themselves what's going on in the rest of the world. So I'm really involved in this idea of educational exchange and cultural exchange as an important way of, I think, really working for justice. And I really see that's part of what I do. I work with Fulbright as well. I'm on the educational executive committee for them. So I work with all sorts of students who are applying to go to the US. So I help them with how to apply to US institutions oftentimes for graduate school. And then I also do like the vetting of the applications that are coming in from the US research side, people who want to come and research in Indonesia. I spent like half of 2019 working in Vietnam for an educational tourism company that had programs in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, helping to train some of their local staff about responsible travel and how to deal with students and things like that, and how to build sustainable programs. So that was a fun change for a while, but my heart is definitely in this part of the world in a lot of ways. And then right as we sort of wrapped up the Australia program, the world changed pretty dramatically with the COVID virus.
Yes.
I'm actually about to come home for my first visit in about 4 years. And my mom works in healthcare. She's in Florida now. And she said, this is not the time for you to be coming back here. It's not safe to be flying, first of all, halfway across the world. Yeah. And also, if you come back, you will be stuck with your sister and her husband, and not be able to leave the house. And I don't know if that's a great idea for a period of time. So I feel very safe here. I'm actually in Bali now, which has quite a lower population than Java. Java is the most populated island in the world. It has about 141 million people, whereas Bali has about 4 million. And of course, since I've been working here the last 2 years, trying to help out because tourism is a huge part of the supporting industry here in the economy. And so it's pretty devastating for a lot of people because tourism has completely stopped. The government is not allowing any foreigners to come in at this point in time. So It's not so much in Bali. We have quite low transmission rates here in Bali, but people are also struggling to eat in a lot of places, struggling financially because their businesses are going under. There's no tourism. And so looking at that also for the future of sustainable issues on this island is having a huge part of your economy being based on tourism development. Is that sustainable for the future of people here? And that's part of what I teach about in our courses for the Australian program.
Has it started to open back up a little?
No, we were really late in having any sort of restrictions, and there was never any lockdown here. So we actually just really started the restrictions about a month or so ago, where other countries had lockdown in Southeast Asia quite early, and they're reopening. They're saying now maybe October, November here, they will start letting foreigners back in. So we've just the country has reopened for some domestic tourism, but most people are not flying right now. It's quite difficult. You need a lot of paperwork in order to even get on a plane. So it's pretty non-mobile at the moment. People aren't really moving.
I mean, it sounds like a pretty dire situation for those who rely on those dollars that come in from tourism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let me ask you about the climate in America. You are watching it from afar, and not just what's happening right now. Over the past, you've been there for a better part of a decade.
Yeah.
How has Indonesians or any foreigners outside of America, how do you think their perception of America has changed over the time that you've been there from what you're seeing?
I think if for Indonesia in particular, again, there's a real sense of looking up to America, and that's very common around Indonesia. Despite what you hear in the media that Muslims in Indonesia don't like Americans, that's patently not really true. And for the most part, when you say you're from America, people are very excited. They think of America as a place of opportunity as well. So it's really a dream for people to send their children to go to school in the United States, for instance. And then, of course, we have the Obama connection. So Obama's mother was also an anthropologist in my department at the University of Hawaii before my time. And she lived in Indonesia and worked in Indonesia for many years. So people sort of feel like Obama was also their president. Like they talk about him as though he's Indonesian. They'll be like, oh, Obama, like he's so cool. He speaks Indonesian, which he doesn't, by the way. But his younger sister is half Indonesian because when his mother got divorced from his father, she remarried an Indonesian guy from Java. And I know his sister pretty well. And she's actually fluent in Indonesian. And she comes back to Indonesia quite often. It's very involved here. But I can't tell you how many times I've been in a cab and someone's like, oh my gosh, Obama. And I'm like, yeah, I actually know his sister. And they go, oh yeah, sure you do. And I'm like, no, but I really do. And who knows if they believe me or not. I get a lot of questions from people about Trump, sort of like, what do you think of Trump? And does he not like Indonesia? And I'm thinking, oh, I don't know if Trump knows where Indonesia is half the time. Who knows what his knowledge about Indonesia is? But I think I see it more with my students who are in grad school and I think are really looking at the history. We have a very direct connection, Americans and Indonesians, because the CIA actually was part of the coup in 1965 when Suharto took over the country in a very violent sort of way. So we assisted that because we were afraid the original president of Indonesia, Sukarno, was supporting communism in Asia. And this was part of our anti-communism movement in Asia. So we were involved in that. And this was a massive genocide that still to this day affects people's lives. If you were considered or accused of being a communist in 1965, your family still has this sort of taboo around them. They're discriminated against. They have a taint in a way. And it's something that's very difficult for people to talk about here openly, even at this point in time. So I think my students who know more about the history of the American intervention in Indonesia have different perspectives and opinions on what the relationship is like. But I think in general, what I talk to my students about a lot, both Indonesian students and American students, is that Indonesia and America are very similar in a lot of ways. They are multicultural, multiracial nations where there is no one kind of Indonesian and there's no one kind of American either. And both countries struggle with that diversity in a lot of ways, in very similar ways. In how do we make rules and regulations for such a diverse group of people? How do we make sure that everyone is treated fairly and equitably? And of course, just like in America, we have groups in Indonesia who don't get treated the same as other groups. The way in which the difference is understood is different, but the actual situation is very similar. And I think both countries have an immense amount to learn from each other. So right now, as Black Lives Matter protests are happening around America, Indonesians are watching this and tweeting about this and trying to see okay, so what does this mean for us? And part of how it's been reflected here is that there's a lot of discrimination and police brutality and military brutality against the Black people of Indonesia, who are the Papuans who live in West Papua. And this now has become a way which the activists here can kind of look at the movement in the US and say Black Lives Matter, not just in America, but Black Lives Matter in Indonesia too. And we need young people to stand up and say that the discrimination against this group of people in our country that is widespread and also perpetrated by government organizations needs to stop. As someone who lives outside of the United States, I think America maybe sometimes forgets or something that the whole world is always watching them.
Yeah.
That the whole world is kind of waiting to see, okay, what is this country that we look up to? I think this is in the case of Indonesia. How are they going to deal with this? Because we always thought that everything in America was great and nobody was racist there. I hear students say this all the time. Oh, but there's no racism in America. And having to unpack that for my students here and well, of course there is. But that's not their perception of what America is. Their perception is that America is really great in a way that, the everyday sort of person. Academics may have a very different perspective. And I think people who are involved in activism, of course, see things that are perpetrated by America in Southeast Asia. One of the largest mines in the world, mining company, is in West Papua, and it's owned by Americans. It's called Freeport, and there's a lot of controversy around that. So yeah, it's a complicated picture, but we're all talking about this in Indonesia too. We're all talking about Black Lives Matter and what does it mean for Indonesians and the diversity of Indonesia, and how do we have a movement that's happening in America? How do we do that same kind of awareness raising here in Indonesia? Yeah. So I think in that way, it's positive. It's having a positive effect here because it's getting young people interested because they see what's going on in the U.S. and they think, oh, that doesn't happen in Indonesia. And then activists are putting two and two together and saying, oh no, but we have a similar problem here.
I hope it does spark a global movement or a global reawakening, I guess, of diversity in everyone's countries. You mentioned that you were going to come back here a few months ago before the virus hit and you didn't make it. How often do you make it back here?
It's been 4 years since I went back the last time. As I had mentioned earlier, I was making this film over the last couple of years with the community here and doing a project related to that where we were taking the film to different cities around Indonesia to have discussions with people in public forums and then bringing the people from this community to Java to my town and having them meet with people and talk to people. So that was something that I was busy with here, kind of traveling around. It always seems like when I'm about to go back to the States, someone offers me some interesting project and I just go, oh, Mom, you got to wait another few months, But she sort of put her foot down this time and said, okay, after, once the calms down the virus issue, you got to come home and see your family for a little while. So I have a ticket.
Yeah.
I just can't use it at the moment. So
How's your grandma doing?
Grandma's hanging in there. It's been a bit tough on her, having her husband pass away
Yeah.
at this time. I think she's quite confused about what's going on, and she keeps asking me when I'm going to come and see her. And I keep trying to explain that there are no planes, and she says, "Oh yeah, it's the same as here. Yeah, it's kind of the same as everywhere." But that's a bit out of her realm of understanding at this point. She's not online or
Yeah.
anything. She never has been, and so sometimes it'll be like questions like, "Wait, you live in Indonesia, right?" And I'll say, "Yeah, yeah, you remembered." She'll say, "And that's in the Middle East, right?" And no, no. Well, it's over on that side of the world, but no, not the Middle East. Or she'll ask me things like, "So do you have to cover your head there?" I don't know where she gets these ideas, right? And I say, "No, who told you that?" "I don't
Yeah.
know. I saw it on TV." So she's hanging in there, but it's not easy, I think, to be of her age, especially at this time.
Is she still in the house?
She's still in the house right now. I don't know how long that's going to last.
Yeah.
My grandfather was in care I think in Lewiston or something for quite some time because he had pretty bad dementia before he passed away. And I
Oh,
think she's also starting down that path where things are getting a bit confusing. So my dad has been up there trying to figure out what they're going to do, whether they're going to sell the house. But she doesn't want to go, as my grandfather didn't want to go. That's been their whole
yeah.
life in that house with that plot of land, and it's a very
Yeah.
disorienting feeling, I think, to be told that you can't stay in the place that you've lived all your life.
Sure. Absolutely. You mentioned that you were married before. You're not anymore?
Yeah, we're not married. We still keep in touch. So that was an interesting part of my
Yeah.
life, having a Tourette family who lived in a traditional house on the top of a mountain, kind of thing. So family vacations were really fun.
Yeah.
And I did live with his deceased grandfather many times when we went to visit, who was deceased but in the house, and
Wow.
we still treated him as though he
Wow.
was a living person. We talked to him and fed him food, like gave him offerings and things like that. But we're not
Wow.
together anymore. It was He's actually, my ex-husband lives in Yogyakarta now and has a business there. So he had lived there with me while I was teaching, and was able to start a business there and is still there now because Taraja is quite rural, quite remote. So it's not the easiest place to live if you want to run any kind of business. You have to be kind of closer to Java where things are going on. So
All right, cool. Thank you so much for talking to me about all this.
yeah, like I have a million questions for you. I realized the podcast was
Oh yeah,
all
ask.
me.
Come on. I'm right here.
So you've got like a gaggle of little ones, which is amazing.
I do have a gaggle. I've got three.
How's it being a parent right now during the whole coronavirus thing?
Well, it's stressful, that's for sure, just
Yeah.
because it's balancing work and education and also entertainment and
Yeah.
just overall supervision of little
Yeah.
ones. It's tough. My wife's a teacher, so she can't, she right now is still technically working and she's got 24 kids in her class that she also is responsible for educating in some sort of way. So it's just a lot of splitting up time and deciding, okay, you're going to watch the kids at this time and you're going to go record a podcast at this time. And then I'm going to hop on the computer and I got to talk to my kids at this time. But I feel like, and I told my last person that I talked to on the podcast, is like we've fallen into a routine now. Like it's still stressful, but at least it's like organized stress.
Organized stress. Yeah. That sounds about right. It's hard to be an educator right now. And I'm watching, as an educator, still kind of doing those kinds of activities and watching my friends too who are educators trying to figure out how to teach online all of a sudden who might have not had experience with
Yeah.
that, and the extra work that you're doing now working from home. It is really stressful. And I really
Yeah.
admire anyone like keeping it handled right now. And I can't imagine doing it with three kids at home, as well as trying to educate a whole classroom of kids online. So your wife must be pretty phenomenal
Yeah.
to be handling that with such grace.
I mean, I worry about whether or not this is going to, people say the new normal. I worry about whether or not this really is going to be the new normal because I don't know how sustainable it's going to be for people with young kids, especially if daycares don't open or schools aren't back in some sort of way to give parents the opportunity to get the work done that they need to get done so they can be there for their children. I feel like a lot of things might fall through the cracks. And what's going on now with the 100% justified protests in the street? After months of being told you have to lock down, don't go near people 6 feet apart, obviously we're going to have a rise. Again, we're going to have another spike of this virus, and we're just going to prolong this lockdown. And I'm worried about what that's going to mean in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. it's pretty terrifying to watch from afar, and frustrating and upsetting, and just watching
Yeah.
video after video on social media of what's happening and just being, I think, sad and angry. So yeah, I can
Yeah.
imagine it's
Yeah.
even 10 times worse being in the middle of it and really experiencing it every day happening around you.
And then balancing, the toughest thing for me was probably like 4 or 5 days ago. I had to explain to Lucy and Molly, who are 8 and 7, what was happening because they didn't understand. They don't have a concept of that type of injustice. They don't get it. Of course, they've learned civil rights and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and all that stuff, but they don't think it's still happening. It's so silly to
Right.
them, and to have to sit
Yeah.
down and then kind of like take that innocence away from them and say, "Well, actually, here's what's really happening, and you need to know," was tough because I didn't want to tell them. I wanted them to just remain blissfully ignorant to all of that,
Yeah.
but they had to know.
And how did they react when you told them? What did they say, or how did they feel? And do you think that they even have a comprehension of it now? Like, what was their reaction?
Well, they didn't. I mean, they didn't have like this big profound moment or anything. It was more just like, "Well, that's dumb," type of thing.
It should be like literally everyone's reaction. Yeah, that is
Right.
dumb.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
that's dumb.
And how do
But
you see, I mean, I guess I can ask you a sort of similar question about your wife is an educator, and like, what do you see as the future for you as a family, wanting your kids to grow up in a place where they're aware of what's happening and have some sort of way of dealing with it? Do you foresee that things are going to change in that way in the United States now, that we're going to work better to have better education or better ways to talk to our kids about these kinds of things?
I think that's the goal, right? I mean, we need to be able to have an open dialogue about these kinds of things. Otherwise, they're just going to persist.
Hmm.
We need to be able to teach the kids to call out racism when they see it, to be aware of it, and to make their voices heard about it, and to be able to speak openly about it instead of in whispered tones to one another. Like they have to be able to make their voices heard and say, "Hey, you know what? I saw something. It was wrong, and here's why it was wrong."
But it's frightening, I'm sure, as a parent also. And I think so many parents are experiencing this, especially people of color, about how do you tell your kids to stand up for things and yet keep them safe?
Mm,
I can't. I can't imagine dealing with that and just sitting at home at night and worrying about that. Like, are my kids going to be safe if they do the
yeah,
right thing? And that's got to be
yeah.
terrifying as a parent. I can imagine.
It sounds cliche, but it really does all start with the voting. You've
Yeah.
gotta I mean,
Well,
tha and
yeah.
that's what you gotta do. I mean, that's how you can make the most impactful changes by making sure that you get people in there that have your sense of justice and sense of value.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, this is just such a cool conversation to have after 25 years, right? Who would
Ugh,
have thought all that time ago, hanging out in Wilson, that we'd be talking about these issues and how our kids are facing them, and what the world
yeah,
is like, talking from half a world away.
I know.
That's pretty astounding in itself. So the world is a fascinating place.
When's the last time you were in Wilson?
Oh gosh, I think the last time I was in Wilson was probably the last time I was home. I think it was 4 years ago. I took a 3 or 4 day trip up there. It was the middle of the winter and just brutally cold. So we stared out the window at the snow, and my grandparents said, "Oh, look at the temperature. It's this many below zero." And I had just come from Indonesia and I was not prepared for that. So that was the last time I was there. My fond memories of Western New York winter.
I'm heading up there in a couple weeks. We're gonna go up, even though we've debated on what we're gonna do, like, because we don't wanna bring to my parents any virus or anything like that, but we've all
Sure.
kind of talked and made a decision that we're gonna go spend a few weeks there and just kinda be together for a couple of weeks. Since everybody's working from home, we can all work from there, so
Right. Yeah.
and the kids love it. The kids need to see their grandparents, and the kids wanna swim in their pool.
No, I mean that's the thing, right? There is nothing cooler for a kid than a Western New York Wilson summer. It's just
Yeah,
kind of magical in its way, especially when
yeah,
you're that age. So it's something that your kids are lucky to get to experience, like we did, I guess.
yeah. Alright, so you're gonna stay there for a while then, right? Is that your home?
Well, I'm stuck here for now. I don't think I'll be going anywhere within the next few
Yeah,
months, but hopefully to the States when things are safe for travel, for at least a little bit, to see my family and to go see my grandmother in Western New York. Yeah, so keep in touch, and I hope that you guys weather all out safely with your sanity intact. So, and you get some nice summer vacation in Wilson, and with Grandma and Grandpa to give you guys some space, I'm sure will be a blessing. So, and it was really wonderful to have a chance to talk to you. Thank you so much for inviting me to chat about my very peripatetic life. So,
absolutely, you're the only learned doctor I know.
Well, we always like to joke. You got to get your T-shirt that says "Doctor," and then on the back it should say "of philosophy," which means really that you can't do much of anything. So, other than philosophy, it does sound really good when you say it out loud, I guess. Yeah, and next time I'm back in the States, I hope we have a chance to intersect or meet up at some point. I'd love to meet your wife and your kids. And
absolutely, yeah.
All right, Matt. Thanks so much. Cheers.
All right, that was my chat with Kelli Swazey. I think it was so great to catch up with her. She has had so many amazing, interesting experiences since I last spoke to her in the 90s. So the magic of podcasts, this has given me an excuse to talk to people I haven't talked to in many, many years and catch up with them and see how they're doing and just hear about their lives and honestly be inspired by them. So if you want to inspire me as well, and inspire this audience, why don't you give me a shout at caughtbyhappy@gmail.com, or you can DM me on any of the social networks. And maybe you can get on the show and talk about your life story, what you're doing, why you're doing it, why you love it, why you're following your dream, and you can get that message out there to the world. I used Squadcast when I recorded this interview with Kelli, and if you do any kind of remote recording, especially with people who are half a world away, I suggest you look into using Squadcast. Each person is recorded to their own separate track, so that makes editing a whole lot easier, and if for some reason, if there's anything wrong with your original download, Squadcast makes a backup of it available to you if you need it. So look into Squadcast using the link in my show notes, and if you sign up, it'll let them know that I sent you and just help support the show, like any affiliate link in my show notes. And this podcast was powered by Ring Media. Join the Ring Media Network and let's make good stuff together. You can find Ring Media online at rringmedia.com. Okay, everybody, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.